Warren, thank you so very much for taking the time to connect. Always a pleasure to chat with Hunter Industries, and especially you, and learn about the fantastic things that are happening in your industry, but also how you see ESG being on the other side of the table, right? On the implementation side of ESG itself and the execution of an ESG program. Before we jump into the conversation for today, I thought I'd give you the opportunity to introduce yourself.
Sure, and thank you for the opportunity to be here, Raj. It's been fun watching this whole ESG journey and how it's evolving. And I'm sure by the time people are watching this, it'll probably be different than when we're talking about today. Yeah. It just seems like it's changing that fast. So my name is Warren Gorowitz, and I'm the Director of Corporate Social Responsibility at Hunter Industries. We were founded in 1981. We're a family-owned manufacturer of landscape irrigation, agriculture irrigation, outdoor lighting, away from home dispensing technology, which is things like paper towel, soap, and air care type products for washrooms, commercial washrooms, and then finally a custom manufacturing business, which does manufacturing, molding, and production services. So pretty diverse business. And I've worked for Hunter it'll be 3 years this August of 2022, which is pretty exciting. I spent 25 years of my career previously working for Hunter's second largest distributor in the landscape and irrigation distribution space. So I've spent my whole career working in the landscape industry, irrigation industry specifically, and it's been fun to watch that evolve into sustainability for my career and also from an ESG standpoint. And and I'm kind of curious to see where it will go in the remaining time that I have left in my career too.
Many years ahead, I'm sure. Congratulations on the 3-year anniversary. I did not know it was 3 years.
Thank you.
But it's also a milestone anniversary as well for Hunter, right? The 10th year of publishing a CSR report.
Yeah, later this year in July, we'll be releasing our 10th anniversary or 10th annual CSR report, and we're definitely excited about that. I think, I think I bring an interesting perspective, and our company brings an interesting perspective in the CSR world because, for one thing, if I go back, and again, I wasn't here when we started our CSR reports, just watching Hunter over the years in my career, I mean, there really were very few, if any, other manufacturers in our space that were looking at CSR. And I think that is definitely something that makes us stand out. And it's also inspiring now to see other of our competitors and other people in our industry starting to see that this is something that's so important. Now, their motives may be a little different than ours, and we can talk about that later. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's definitely something that people are more familiar with now than certainly when we started 10 years ago. But at the same time, it's even more important now as well.
Yeah, I mean, given how things have changed, 10 years is no small period of time within the sustainability space. 10 years ago, and I know you weren't part of Hunter at the time, but to make that decision would have been an interesting one when the manufacturing industry was not necessarily talking about sustainability, CSR, or ESG on the scale that it is today. But also your subsector was not one of the typical ones that anyone would have thought about when they thought about sustainability, right? Everyone was still thinking about oil and gas and energy and the typical players. So do you know why Hunter chose to pursue doing as a private organization in the landscape irrigation business and all the other businesses? What prompted the management to decide, no, let's produce a CSR report?
I think it's really tied to our values as a company, and social responsibility is one of our values and important to the Hunter family. And that really was part of the foundation of our company back in 1981. And so I think that's really what has led us focusing on that. And, it's interesting too, because in order to prioritize really where we place our efforts around CSR, we need to reach out and understand what it's important to our stakeholders. And that, is not a easy process often, but it is a very important process. And so for us, we survey our stakeholders every 3 years doing our materiality assessment. And so for us, our stakeholders are our internal stakeholders, of course, our employees, our customers, also our suppliers who we purchase materials from, and even this past materiality assessment that we did in October of 2021, we even surveyed we sent out the survey to our grant recipients for part of our charitable giving as well, fantastic, to understand what's important to them as well.
So they were a new stakeholder group in this last materiality assessment, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, we've been as an organization, we've been giving back to the communities for a long time, but from my knowledge, it was the first time we actually included them in our materiality assessment. And I think that what's interesting is that if you look across all of our different stakeholders, that what was important to them was fairly consistent. And that's really what has allowed us to target and focus our area specifically. And we made some changes this year to our target areas, which we'll be reporting on in our CSR report again that's coming out soon. But most everything else was pretty consistent from previous materiality assessments. And one of the things that we also did as well that you'll see in our upcoming report is most companies have been focusing on doing the materiality matrix. Yes. And one of the challenges with the matrix is, and we did hear this feedback even from some of our internal leadership, is you look at things being rated, and does that mean what's at the bottom is not important to your organization? And so in our report this year, you'll see our materiality areas listed alphabetically, because that means that they're all important. Yeah. And in this way, we will obviously identify, and we've identified and are focusing on projects specific to each one of those areas that are going to help us achieve what our goals and our targets are.
No, that's fantastic. I'm looking forward to that. Would be quite new. At least I have not seen a report that has simply listed the stakeholders or the topics alphabetically. It has always been on the heat map or the matrix. I'm curious, how did you all figure out to now include a new stakeholder group? Was this just a management decision? How do you all determine who forms part of the stakeholder groups?
Yeah, I think it was just identifying like who we interact with and whose voice is important to us to help us make sure that we're focusing on the right things as well. And I think the other thing that puts our perspective a little bit differently, and it's certainly not in the limelight as much on what you hear publicly about ESG these days, is that we're a private company, like you had said. And so we don't have investors telling us we have to do these things, or, and we do it, like I said earlier, because it's part of our core values as a company. And I think that makes my job that much more interesting and that much more fun in a sense too, because yes, there's pressure, because I do know we do sell products to a lot of publicly traded companies as well. And I do know that, and I anticipate that we'll be getting more and more pressure. They'll be pressuring their suppliers, I should say, maybe not necessarily us, but they'll be pressuring their suppliers to make sure that ESG is a priority. And so the great thing is that, we have something to look back on and show them that this is a priority, and here's what we're doing, and here's why we're doing it. And, and here's also how we're all working together on this too. I think that's a thing that's really important,
I think that's an invaluable nugget. I mean, the proactive approach you all took to CSR means that you're not now scrambling to improve your sustainability profile because someone you're selling to has asked you for that information, right? You already have all of this.
Right.
Just by taking a proactive approach. I think that is, definitely.
Yeah, and does it make it any easier? Not necessarily, because the challenges are continuing to be greater and greater, and I think that's part of how we, like I said, how we balance what we're doing, what we're focusing on. But also from a reporting standpoint as well, we've done a GRI report, I want to say, I think 2 times previously, and we are actually moving back towards that. Our report this year will not be reporting to GRI standards, but we are kind of laying it out, so we're getting ready to do that for next year's report.
What prompted the return to GRI?
And this is so much about obviously all the alphabet soup and reporting, of course. And for us, and the reason it was important for us to go back to GRI is because it allows us to put ourselves on the same playing field. It is an internationally recognized standard for reporting. I'm interested to see how that changes, and with some of the things going on, here in the U.S. and also even in Europe, and some of the things that could morph in and modify, like how businesses and the requirements of reporting, again, for especially for publicly traded companies. So yeah, for us, it's a recognized standard. What's interesting, though, candidly, is how many of our customers even understand what GRI is. I think that's been one of the challenges, for the amount of effort that takes to reporting against those standards, and the amount of work that goes into putting together a report, and but at the same time, we know it's the right thing to do, and so that's why we're moving back towards that for next year.
So have you found yourself in a position of also educating customers on GRI and the information you're asking for, and why all of this is relevant?
Yeah, I wouldn't say we've specifically targeted education around GRI, but we definitely are always educating our customers on corporate social responsibility, and why it's important, not only to us, but why it should be important to them. And so, I think that's going to be a continuing journey, and maybe in a lot of cases, again, depending on the sector of our customer base, they may not necessarily know some of the terminology, but they definitely understand the concepts. And I think that's also something that puts us in a really interesting place, especially from our primary industry in the landscape and irrigation industry, is the impact that the positive and the negative impacts that can have on the environment as well. And that's definitely been exacerbated because of COVID, good and bad,
Yeah, it almost pulled the veil off of everything, right? And forced you to look at issues that you wouldn't necessarily be considering before. One thing you mentioned in that last piece that jumped out at me, and it was a question I had reading more and more about Hunter, was you mentioned terminology. And we all know the acronym ESG is the hot thing today. We all know sustainability was the hot term. CSR was the hot term some years ago. There may or may not be a simple reason behind it, but I have to ask, why has Hunter chosen, and if that was made before your time, that's okay, why have you all stuck with CSR?
It was before my time. And it's interesting because in the previous company I worked for, we used sustainability was our buzzword. It was our terminology and how we kind of framed everything that we're doing as an organization. From what I understand and have learned over the past almost 3 years, is we look at CSR, we look at sustainability as being part of CSR. So it's part of the people, planet, and profit thing, which we use the 3 Ps as kind of part of our guidance for everything that we do. But yeah, I think the other reason that we've stuck with it is because of our values as a company, and that social responsibility is one of our values. So it's something that our employees understand, and so we've used that framework. Will it change in the future? I don't know. It's and what's going to be the next buzzword after ESG? This talk now of, and a lot of, and it's interesting how our industry has evolved on the water side, from conservation to efficiency, and now there's this whole terminology and focus around, and it's not just water. The environmental piece is all around resilience. And so I think this has the potential to change to merge into something else potentially in the future. But today it's corporate social responsibility. We always abbreviate it. It's kind of a funny side note. We always abbreviate it, of course, as CSR, and in a lot of cases, especially for people that aren't familiar with that terminology, you have to remind them what it stands for, because CSR stands for other things too. And
in some circles, I've heard people referring to it as corporate sustainability reporting, right?
Sustainability. I've heard it referred to, impact reporting. So yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's just, I think for an organization, especially if you're looking at how you're going to get started in this space and how you're going to start doing your reporting, I think you have to choose the right terminology that resonates with you and your stakeholders. And then the other piece of it, I think that's equally important, is making sure that you align yourself with good partners to help you be successful. And that, you didn't ask me this question, but that's one of the reasons what prompted us to look at FigBytes, was being able to find a partner that could help us make sense of all the data that's involved, especially when it comes to all this reporting and all the things that you have to keep track of. I mean, that in itself is overwhelming at times, to say the least.
Yeah, one of the biggest pillars of ESG management, right? The data side of things. But, and I don't want to gloss over something you said, Warren, because I know where you sit, it might seem like a regular part of business. But from sitting on this side of ESG, where we are a solutions provider, and I talk to clients across markets and geographies, that's a very impactful piece of thought leadership you shared with sticking to the term CSR, and CSR very much being part of Hunter's values, because many organizations, markets, geographies, whatever you want to call them, S is often seen as secondary to E. As we all know, E is the biggest letter, even though it's just the first among equals. And I feel like many clients focus on the E, and S is now catching up. But again, you all are demonstrating that you're ahead of the curve, that you're not just giving in to the wave of E excitement. You are covering your E bases, but part of your values is very much the social side of things. And your ESG program, sustainability program, CSR program, whatever acronym or name you want to give it, it has very much been centered around people.
It really is, and at the end of the day, that's the people in your business and the people you interact with. Well, especially if we look at it internally, it's really what is the foundation for your culture, and having having a focus on the social area, whether that's how we take care of our employees, and especially in the last 2.5 years, 2+ years with COVID, how that's become so exacerbated and so prevalent, is making sure that I mean, if you think about it, in the manufacturing space that we've been in, we shy of like a day and a half, 2 days, we hadn't been shut down. Our business was considered an essential business, fortunately. And so our employees, we had to figure out, and you had to adapt really quickly to figure out how to make sure that we take care of our employees and also continue to be able to manufacture the products that our customers need. And none of us foresaw that, one, it would go on for so long, but two, none of us really saw the fact that, again, and this is the environmental and the social side as well, that what was one of the things that you were allowed to do at the height of the pandemic is people were allowed to be outdoors, and that's a big part of where our products go on the irrigation space, and subsequently also on the agricultural irrigation space. Growing food continues to be a priority, of course, and so. But we didn't really see that at the beginning. You didn't know that was going to be such an important thing. So that helped bring more relevancy to our industry for sure. And then how we interact as a good corporate citizen in the communities that we live, work, play in. That's a priority for us as well, and that's what kind of leads us for what we call our charitable giving that we do, and also how we interact with our employees and bring them into that as well, and recognize and allow them to contribute to organizations that are important to them, and help support those organizations that are also important to them as well.
And I'm curious then, and feel free to tell me, Rajiv, wait till the report comes out. But like every good movie, I'm down for a trailer or a teaser. So that focus on people and the impact on people, the S, if we were to call it the S in ESG or the S in CSR, are you seeing that reflected in the results of your materiality assessment? Are the stakeholders highlighting the importance of S?
Yes. I mean, they are highlighting it, like especially things around like diversity, equity, and inclusion. Of course, is also very become much more. People have become much more aware of it, I guess. Unfortunately or unfortunately, for the things that have happened over the last couple of years, I would still say that the E is still what seems to matter most to people, and part of that, I think, for us. And I think it's a good segue into something else that I know we wanted to talk about, which is water. And the fact is that for us, I mean, water is probably one of our most material topics for a couple of reasons. One, for the products that we manufacture use water. Water is part of our manufacturing process, so that's an important thing for us to make sure that we're being as efficient as possible. But even more importantly, in many of the industries that we work in and where our products go to, they don't exist without water, period.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no question about that. And so if you look at the agricultural sector, again, especially, well, and this is all over the world, that, irrigation in many cases efficient irrigation plays an important role in growing food fiber. That's important. And then on the turf and landscape side of our business, if you look at the fact that outdoor water use in many cases, and I'm going to just throw some numbers from North America, can account for 30% of a total household water use, but as much as 60% of the water that's used in a typical household can be used outdoors. And then you take that water, and as much as 50% of it could be wasted due to
And you're
inefficiency.
talking about outdoor use covering things like gardens, lawns,
Yep.
pools, all of
Yep.
those, washing
Yeah,
vehicles and all
and
that.
that water typically can be, not always, but as much of it can be as 50% of it can be wasted because whether it's lost due to evaporation, to wind, or runoff, which means people are over irrigating, over watering things as well, and that's all tied to irrigation system methods and efficiencies. And so that on our irrigation side of our business is kind of one of the things that drives us is to provide tools for our customers to allow them to irrigate as efficiently as possible. And it's in the crosshairs right now, especially where I am in the West Coast. The current drought that we've been experiencing for not just this year, for several years, almost. I think if you look at the numbers, it's close to like the last decade almost.
Mm.
But the extremes of climate change are making people pay even more attention to water.
Yeah.
And I think it's a double-edged sword in a lot of ways, both for what we do as a manufacturer, but also for our industry as well.
No, that's a very valid point. And even for someone who might be listening to this, water can be a very daunting topic. It's you think of E and everyone jumps to carbon because it's possibly the most well understood or explained side, and even carbon is confusing in its own right. So I don't think a lot of people are talking about W. How then?
At least you can see water.
At least you can see.
You can, because
exactly.
I remember early on in my career, and we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah.
Like, okay, do you
Yeah.
see them, and how do you equate that metric tons to like something that people can understand that? And then you also think about how big of an impact that is and how big these numbers are. And how do you understand that can you really have an impact on that? Can a business, can a business, of course, have an impact on that? At least water is something that's a little bit more understandable because people are using water in their daily lives. And I think that's the other thing too, is that again, speaking from North America, what we take for granted that we turn on our faucet every day for the most part, and the water comes out, and that's not the case in many places in the world. And so I think that you have to put that in perspective, that this resource is not an unlimited resource, and that we have to be good stewards. And so that at the end of the day is something that is a priority for us, and one of the things that drives us for product innovation and new things that we're working on for the future. And then how do you bring those products to market and make them easy for people to use and understand?
Yeah, no, that's an important part. I like that way that you used stewardship, because for most organizations trying to wrap their head around water, it's just focused on consumption.
Mhm.
Do we waste? Do we reuse? Do we recycle? How much are we using? But I think there's a bigger picture involving water, which is the stewardship side of things. I mean, you spoke about the ability in North America. I'm in Canada. We can also open our taps, and for the most part, you have potable water coming through the taps. But then you think right here in North America, where we do have challenges either with drought, that's the environmental side, there's the food security side, but there's also the social side of water when you look at the Flint water crisis. So even here in Canada, getting potable water to our indigenous lands, for example, for the communities that live there, also very much on our front door. What has Hunter's journey been like with water? Meaning, and I'll bring that question down, meaning from just tracking consumption to really looking at water stewardship and the whole water picture. And how far along are you all on that journey? Where do you all have to go still in terms of seeing water as its whole own E, if we might call it that?
Yeah, I would love to tell you that we're farther along than we are, and I say that because everybody starts with, like you said, understanding your own consumption. And so that's something that we've been focusing on for quite some time and continue to try to improve on that. And the next piece of it, though, and the next part of our journey is understanding our water footprint, and that our manufacturing campuses are in diverse areas, but ironically, 2 of the 3 are in water challenged areas here where I am in North County, San Diego, so Southern California, and Tijuana, Mexico. Both areas have significant challenges with water availability. And so we are continuing on our journey to better understand our water footprint and the impact that we have across, across all of our campuses. Our 3rd campus in Florida, outside of Orlando, also has a different water stress, or has gone through different kinds of water stress as well. And so that for us is the next part of our journey, is really looking at our footprint and being able to understand that. And then from there, the hardest part is how do we understand, and how do we measure the consumption of water that our products are being used by our customers?
Ultimately, that's what the product is doing, right? Facilitating the consumption or smart consumption of water.
And the neat thing about, from a management standpoint, is technology that we're all using in our daily lives has been incorporated into the irrigation sector from a water management standpoint. And now you take weather data, soil moisture data, and whether it's a residential landscape, whether it's a golf course, whether it's a commercial sports field, and you take that data, and actually it allows the user to make smarter decisions on how much water they should be using. Now, I'm a huge fan of technology, but I also am a realist and recognize that the technology is not. And by the way, drones, can now look at large sites and actually see how much moisture is in the soil and the fertilization levels and things like that. And like I said, technology is great, but it doesn't replace smart people that work in this space as well, that have to truly understand it. Because unlike indoor water that is typically regulated by a faucet, a toilet, a shower, or something like that, outdoor water is a system. And so you have an irrigation system that's designed, installed, maintained. It all has to be done by people that are knowledgeable and understand that, and then using the right technology for the right application. And so somebody has, and you're watering plants that are different than, that require different amounts of water, and you need to understand what's the right amount of water for that plant. And so that's the cool thing about technology, is it's helping, but I still see that you need people that are understanding and can and understand the basic concepts of horticulture and soil health and plant health and water management and so forth. So
what's the next step, I should say, for water for Hunter?
Next step again is continuing to identify and understand our water use in the manufacturing process on our campuses, continue to get more granular with that identification. And then, like I said, it's looking at our footprint and better understanding that how we're affecting our watershed here in our different manufacturing campuses, and how do we minimize that impact on the watershed. And then, because a big part of what we do, especially in the irrigation industry, is work on education as well. And so how can we educate our clients around that as well, so they understand the importance of it? I don't think people think about that. Like I said, you turn on your faucet, water comes out, you water your landscape, or you're maybe out in the yard working on your landscape or growing your vegetables, but understanding what happens downstream of you with the water, if the water does, get, and I think if the water's running off of the landscape. And I think the other piece of it, and this gets into the politics of water today, is that there's a delicate balance from a let's just say residential commercial standpoint around our water use, because we're being told we have to reduce our water use, which is right. We want to make sure that we're being as efficient as possible with how we're using it. There's more prescriptive nature in how we should be using our water that's coming from municipalities, which could be a whole other discussion we could have and another rabbit hole to go down. But the other rabbit hole and the other part of that discussion that I think that's delicate is when when the municipality is seeing people use less water, their revenue is declining.
Yes.
And so they have to make up for the lost revenue. And in many cases, that also means that, and this isn't just water, this could be energy too,
Yeah.
that in many cases, the utilities are raising their rates. And so people are paying more per unit that's being used. And so it's, it's a very interesting challenge that we see in not just in our industry, just in general with water and energy too.
And it's interesting, not to take us down a philosophical part, but as you mentioned, the politics on the politics or the relationship of politics to water. It's interesting because we're seeing, just based on what's happening in the world, we're seeing extreme distributions of water where in some cases there are extreme droughts and then in other cases extreme floods, right? And as more urban areas start developing, we're expecting most of the world's population to live in urban developed areas where we tend to have most of the flooding. So I do believe, yeah, the political side, the municipalities, the developers, they also share a relationship with water beyond the consumption and thinking about the things that happen out on the farms where we don't see or interact with on a day-to-day basis. We just reap the benefits of the food, but we have no idea where the food comes from and the challenges it faces with water.
Yeah, and I think to your point on these environmental side and the climate extremes, I mean, there's so much planning that has to go into play because of how things are changing and will continue to change. And if you look at it from a risk mitigation standpoint as well, I mean, just understanding the impact that climate change is going to have on your business. And if we look at, things that are going on today as we speak around raw material availability, so that's affecting supply chain, around shipping and transportation. We have this global economy, and yet, and how paralyzed it can be when you rely on materials to come from overseas and then they get held up sitting at, let's say at one of the ports and stuff sitting off. I don't know what the current count today is, but I'm sure it's probably still over 100 ships that are sitting off of the port of Long Beach here in Southern California that are still waiting with materials that are still waiting to be received and distributed. And so, that I think is also ties into this whole environmental side and the social side and the governance side for that matter as well of CSR and sustainability, because I think as a business, you have to see, how you can, is it possible to control your supply chain better? And can you do it in a way that still allows the company to be, to continue to grow and be profitable? And I think that's going to continue to be a challenge. And for sure, I mean, you look at with the pandemic again, and when there's a increase in COVID in certain parts of the country, and they just shut down because they have to protect their people, and all of a sudden, materials aren't being produced and so forth, and how much of a quick impact that has, and anyway, I mean, it's fascinating to see all this ties together, and I guess I think the thing that I look at is the fact that if you take away one of the positives from the pandemic is it's brought in heightened awareness on all of this. And
definitely has,
And I think it's not something you can ignore anymore. And then at the same time, for the people that have been in the space for a long time that have been saying, hey, we need to start acting sooner and we need to act faster. That's probably the frustration point for a lot of those people is it's like, we're not doing enough quick enough to mitigate the impacts that we are having on the climate.
Yeah.
So, it's daunting at the same time. And I guess that's opportunities for new people coming into the space on how these challenges are going to get solved. And for those of us that'll still be here for a while, like how do we all solve what do we do to solve these challenges, and who do we work with, and how do we do this together, which is a thing that I think has also been brought in light because of all the things that are going on.
Well, thank you for sharing. I want to be respectful of your time as well. There's one other topic that I want to touch on, and I think it perfectly wraps up or summarizes everything that we've discussed before in a nice neat point. That's the concept of strategy. Now, you all have been doing CSR. I hate that phrase, doing CSR, but you all have been down the CSR journey for a few years now. This is the 10th year of your report. You obviously, 10 years later, were not at the same point that you were from day one on the strategy side of things. You also mentioned, aligning the values to the 3 Ps. What has the journey been like getting to the point that you are at today? in terms of your strategy? How did you come up with your strategy? How did you determine what goes into your strategy, the goals that you're setting? Because for many of the companies that we're talking to who don't have 10 years of experience under their belt producing these reports, they're simply overwhelmed. And we're also trying to tell them that's okay. The important thing is that you start and then you can refine as you get along. You can't start with the perfect strategy. So what has that journey been like for Hunter?
Well, to your point, and there's a philosopher that said the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And so like you can't, it's easy to feel paralyzed because there's so much, it's overwhelming. And I think that, yeah, as you said, you just need to start somewhere. And I think that from our perspective and what we've done from a strategy standpoint is we started at the beginning talking about understanding what's important to your stakeholders. So that's kind of the first thing that you need to do. You need to understand what's important to your stakeholders. And then as you're developing your strategy, I think it's important that you don't do it in a vacuum, even inside your organization. And I think that you need to involve all the key areas of your business, and they need to be part of that discussion. And that's something that I think has continued to evolve in our organization. Again, I only have 3 years of experience, but just from as I've listened to and talked with others throughout our organization, is that and so that means for us, that means setting up. We have what's called the Csr Council, and that's representation from all of our areas of our business, and they help me and my team of myself and our CSR coordinator. They help us kind of guide our CSR strategy for the organization as well. And so you're getting that input. And then the other thing that probably is just as important and that I've been really focusing on, is that you also need to figure out how do you take that strategy and bring that down so every employee in the organization understands how they impact that. We're getting there. I'd say we're making strides and lots of improvement, but that continues to be, it will always continue to be a focus for me, is making sure that, that if in our manufacturing space, how does the person that's working in the manufacturing floor understand what they're doing every day and how that impacts our CSR strategy, our CSR goals, and then setting goals and targets that you asked about as well. I think, you look at, and we did a climate action plan, which helped us and worked with a consultant to put that together and kind of built some of our targets, like our greenhouse gas reduction targets and some of our other targets. Although we didn't certify to the SBTI, Science-Based Target Initiative, that was the framework for it. And so we built them out accordingly. But then you need to set some goals, make them stretch goals so they're not so easy to attain. And then, that allows the organization to figure out, okay, now how are we going to get there? And what do we need to do in order to do that? And what resources do I need? And who needs to be, who do I need to make sure is involved? And then, and I think for us, most recently on this most recent, after we did our materiality assessment, and as you'll see talked about in our upcoming CSR report, it's involving those process owners in the discussion around how we're going to get to those goals, because it's easy for a group of people to set the goals and targets, and now we got to figure out how we're going to get there. But if you involve those people that are responsible for that into that discussion when you're setting those goals and targets, then you have support and buy-in, and it becomes part of everybody's. They understand why it's important, and so you're not going back and saying, oh, by the way, we set this target and we're going to reduce this usage by X% by this year. Go figure it out, instead of, oh yeah, we were part of setting that goal. The other people that are important to that are going to help make it happen, and they understand why, and they can help you get the resources, and they can also become a champion as well for those initiatives.
What has then been the role, and you alluded to this earlier as well, what has then been the role of implementing your CSR strategy with a technology partner? What value add has having technology on that journey brought to the organization?
Absolutely. Well, and then we talked about a little bit earlier when we were talking about kind of tracking some of our usage of our resources and things, is, there's so much data in an organization that sits in a lot of different places. whether it's in different businesses, in different parts of the world, and being able, technology and having a technology partner is important to be able to actually gather all that data and keep it someplace. And then just as important, be able to actually do something with the data. So how do we do analysis against the data? And then how do we share the results of that data? Because that's the other challenge is that in many cases, that data lives with a process owner somewhere, and they do their reporting on it, maybe for their own little department or their team, but the rest of the organization doesn't see it. And so having a technology partner and that to be able to actually take that data, do the analysis against it, and then figure out ways to easily communicate and share it with your stakeholders is really what's most important, and has been as I mentioned earlier, that's why FigBytes has been with us on this journey, and allowing us to actually do that and actually be able to take that data and share it out, and then and then allow people to understand what to do with the data as well. Yeah. Because data without a story is just data. It's just numbers. Yeah. You got to pull the story into the communication piece of how that data is and why it's important, how it can be used.
No, that's fantastic, because that's, if I may summarize or paraphrase, then engagement is possibly one of the most critical parts of any CSR program. And unfortunately, it's one of the more forgotten elements. I think most organizations boil it down to just producing a CSR report or a sustainability report or ESG report, but not actually engaging stakeholders and having that feedback loop into your ESG strategy and planning. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, without a doubt. And at the end of the day, that you can put a nice report together, but you're right. You have to engage your stakeholders, and then you have to do something with all that information too.
Yeah. All right. Well, I know we're coming close to the time, so Warren, I wanted to say thank you so very much for chatting. Always a pleasure. I hope we get to have many more of these conversations where we can deep dive into some of these topics.
Yeah, thank you, Raj. It's been fun. I do hope we get to do this again. I can think of plenty of other topics we can do.
I would love to. I would love to. This is the first of many. Personally, thank you very much for taking the time to chat.
Thank you again.